Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Labeling in Microsoft 365, Retention and Sensitivity, featuring my good friend and Microsoft MVP, Drew Madelong. My name is Vlad Catrinescu. I'm Syskic's technical evangelist and a Microsoft MVP from Montreal, Canada. And also here with me is Bruno, who will be showing you a demo of Syskit Point later on. Now, most of you might already know Syskit as a company, but for those who don't, let me briefly introduce you. Syskit is a software development company founded more than 15 years ago. We currently have more than 3,500 customers around the world, ranging from small businesses to large corporations. Our flagship product, Syskit Point, is a scalable platform that helps you simplify your Microsoft 365 visibility, governance, and security. Whether you need detailed reports, real-time access management solutions, activity auditing, optimizing storage, usage, or more, Syskit Point has you covered. Now, before we start, just a few housekeeping items. All registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. After Drew's presentation, Bruno will give us a short demo of how Syskit Point can help ensure that your sensitive data is properly labeled and assigned. And after that, we will, of course, have a Q&A session where Drew will answer all the questions that you might have. So please, you have the chance to have an expert such as Drew here live today. Use that Q&A function on the right side of the screen to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter. Drew Madelong is a cloud solutions architect and a Microsoft 365 MVP. He's experienced in a range of technologies and specializes in collaboration and teamwork workspaces such as Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive. Drew has helped deploy Microsoft 365 to many global companies while rolling out modern information protection and information governance technologies. He has been a consultant for over 10 years and a speaker at many Microsoft 365 events, and he gets very sensitive about sensitivity labels. So, perfect for today's topic. Now, Drew, are you ready to go?
I am. Sound good? Do I sound good, Vlad?
Sounds perfect.
Awesome. Let me bring up my screen here. And Vlad, that was quite a good sensitivity joke there.
Thank you so much. I practiced it before.
So, screen looks good, Vlad?
Everything looks awesome.
Awesome. So, I'll be talking today around sensitivity labels and retention labels. So, to kick it off, to make sure you kind of understand where I'm coming from. So, my name is Drew, as Vlad introduced me. I do work at a consulting company called Protiviti, and we do focus in security compliance inside of M365. So I come from long-term SharePoint background, long-time SharePoint MVP, met Vlad many years ago, and my background does come more from the IT pro side. I've evolved in my career, in my work, once it's gone in the cloud, has been much more security and compliance focused, as once we've enabled companies inside of M365, how can we protect that data and manage that data inside of M365? And how is that? It's been interesting to watch us evolve, especially with Copilot over the last 14 months, how much the Purview suite has become more of our primary solution we're deploying instead of other solutions like just standard SharePoint content management that we've done in the past. And that's my role. That's what I've been working. I live in Wisconsin. It's nice and cold up here still. But so glad to be here on this webinar talking about labeling. So I'm going to start talking mainly around data classification and what labeling is. Like, why is it important? What does it mean? And then I'm going to go through first starting with sensitivity labels, going through retention labels, and then talking about throughout this, my experiences in deploying these at many different size companies. I've been doing retention labels at some incredibly large companies, some small companies. I have some same examples for sensitivity labels, large and small. So when I'm thinking about labeling, it's been interesting as how much I've had to start working with organizations with AI. And I want to start because it's impossible to go through a Microsoft level conversation without talking about Copilot. And it does matter as we get into the priority of labeling inside of M365. If I'm doing an audit or a comparison or a review of a company to prepare for AI and you don't have any labeling, it's one of the top things that we're recommending, because as things like Bruno was going to say with Cisco, like you don't know what you don't know. And I can get a report of all of your information, all of your sites, all of your data, but without context of what that is, it leads to challenges to identify what we want to do with it. So if we want to open up this generative AI tech that's here, we need to find ways to classify and manage our content, because there are risks with this AI and the classification can help with it. So how can we detect and mitigate that risk? Using things like labels. How can we use these labels to protect our data both internally, externally, and with AI? And the regulatory pressure has been surmounting, especially with AI, but not just with AI, but with just general data growth. We've been seeing a lot of global growth as far as regulatory controls. Let's say you're part of the CMMC 2.0 push in the next right now. Like, how are we going to use labels to support that? How are we going to ensure we retain our information that meet specific global regulatory controls? So these are risks we have to meet. How can we meet these risks? And labeling is part of that. And what's driving this is not just that compliance, but it's the amount of data. We've seen this proliferation of data. It's actually been very interesting when I started working with M365 is that there was not a concern for data. It was like, we'll have plenty of space. In the last 12 months, I've finally ran into tenants that are running out of space. Physically, they're out of data. And of course, you can procure more, but by having that much data, you are at more risk for rot data, and you're at more risk with having too much data across these systems. And when you have that, people want to adopt AI, they want to move towards these things, but if you have too much stuff and you don't know where it is and you don't have it classified, you have a data hoarding issue, right? You have a scenario that we have too much stuff, we don't know what it is, we don't know if it's sensitive, and we're keeping everything because we don't know if it's sensitive or not. And that leads into a pain points through your general data hygiene, your general data governance that we want to grow, but then your overall AI governance is going to lack because it's shining light into the lack of data hygiene that you've built over the years. So when you think about this, it's going to be, what is your strategy, right? What have you done with it? So as I'm starting, then I'll go through these scenarios. I'm going to be showing you what you can do and a lot of the art of the possible. Every deployment I've done for sensitivity labels and retention is different. There's not a one size fits all. So think about, what is your business critical data? What is your industry that you're in? What are you doing with your controls that you have today to manage data inside and outside of your organization, right? What is important to you? What if I work at a healthcare company? It's very different than if I work with a FinServ company, right? Two very different scenarios that we've been dealing with for regulations, for classifications, for the protections that we need to put in place. And when you're doing this, what are you using today? Are you using anything today? Are you moving from a separate classification solution? Are you using, if you don't have anything yet today, think about how you're protecting your data. Are you using encryption in other scenarios? Just maybe just basic mail encryption. Right? What are you doing today? And these questions that are here will drive what you would need to do at the end of this. So when we think about what we need to do first, we have to protect data wherever it lives. Right? So, and the important word here is life cycle. So people are going to create content, people are going to work with content, people are going to share content, people are going to stop using that content. We need to protect that data wherever it is in that life cycle. Think about it as internal and external, and after that data has been completed. We need to ensure that that content meets the proper compliance requirements. Is there a retention schedule? Is this a board meeting minute? Is this something that is a contractual piece of material that needs to be kept for 6 years based on an EU regulation, right? How can we retain that information but protect it in that life cycle as well? And then when you have this information that's protected as life cycle, how do we prevent unauthorized access, both internal and external? Are we going to encrypt this information? Are we going to stop access to this information? How can we manage this? So these are the key things that we need to do to meet those risks that we talked about. And when you think about that, right, when I work with companies, the main concern is that's a lot, right? That is like I don't know what to do. I don't want it. How can I eat I don't want to, let's say, eat the elephant. There's too much as part of that. I have too many tools that are using this. There's too many points in that tag chain that can be this. I understand our compliance regulations. I've never even looked at our compliance regulations, right? How do we get started in that? So Purview is our solution for that. So Microsoft Purview is our set of solutions that is not just a single point, right? So if you're looking at best of breed solutions, there could be other ones that provide different scenarios for, let's say, data discovery, retention, more advanced scenarios, maybe across data platforms. In the Microsoft suite for governance and protection, you have a single platform now that can meet the compliance requirements for even advanced scenarios like SC17A to govern and protect that data. So Purview is built across three main solutions. We have data security, data governance, and risk and compliance. Those three solutions have been brought together into a single platform. The areas we're going to be looking at around labeling around information protection and data lifecycle management and records management. So we kind of fit in two realms here. So an interesting point when we're working with data with labeling, the reason I'm bringing these together is if I'm doing retention labels with an organization, it's going to be a different team that I work with than if I'm doing the sensitivity labels. You'll have security controls versus compliance controls. So a lot of times they fit under different teams. One might be legal, might be your records managers. One's going to be your CISO org that handles data security, data classification. That might fall under data governance for finding that, but you do live in different realms. So it's important to understand that that's one of the big differences inside of an org is going to be who decides what. What's the RACI? What's the governance of these solutions? And Purview is built to support many. And you as a program, you as an organization need to figure out who does what inside of Purview. And it's been a couple years, but it's good to always know how did we get to Purview? Because if you've been familiar with the prior Azure Purview suite, that has been what really happened a couple years ago was a rebrand. And I like to still say this because what's important is before this happened, there was a lot of segmentation between solutions. So you could have the data governance of Azure Purview, which is your structured data. You could have your DLP and your insider risk management and your records management, and they were all very disparate systems, disparate tools. It was a brand new simplification, but it's also what happened was we moved them all under one umbrella. And we said Purview is going to be a single source, single pane of glass. That also gives us the ability to see interactivity between solutions. So as I talk about, let's say, sensitivity labels, you'll start to see the overlapping scenarios that we're trying to meet the same goals, right? At the beginning, I talked about what we're trying to do, protect, govern, and be compliant. That's not like listed in these solutions. You can become, if I'm going through, let's say, a CMMC compliance, you're going to have to go through every single scenario inside of Purview and map those to controls, not map it by solution. So what matters with this is that it all starts with the data. So when I'm thinking about classification, think about your organization, think about the data that you have. Because it's easy to say I want to deploy labels, but the labels don't do anything that matters unless you know what that data is. So within Microsoft, there's different ways, within Purview, different ways to identify our data. Right? So we have pre-built solutions and our own custom solutions to identify the types of data that we have. And we have out-of-the-box solutions. The out-of-the-box ones provide us pre-built information around different types of sensitive data that's out there to say maybe we want to have this type of file that has PII in it. It's going to have a specific type of classification as defined by our information classification policy. That makes sense. As you keep going, we can get very much more advanced around the types of data that we are tracking or that we're identifying. So we can say, hey, these are the types of HR contracts or these are the types of personnel files in HR all look similar. I want to make sure I retain these HR personnel files for 6 years using retention labels. I can also say, since this HR has personnel information in it, I can identify that personnel file and say that's confidential. Right? So they're not always one-to-one. You're not going to say, you don't really build a classification policy that says sensitivity meets retention. It's going to be, what are your data requirements? And then what are the retention requirements based on that data? What are our sensitivity what is our protection requirements, what the data is important to us, and then what are the sensitivity labels that we want to match to that. Do we have account numbers that we want to automatically identify using things like exact data match, where we can actually do like exact data to pull in? Do we want OCR that we can bring in different types of information that's not just built into Office Docs? Credentials has probably been one of my top ones we've been working with. How do I protect passwords and credentials that are floating inside of the org? Protect that, automatically classify it, ensure that that can't leave the organization. And what that means, how these work together, is that it is all integrated. So what you have is what's called the data classification service. So when you look at your data, there's going to be a service that runs behind the scenes that you can't manage. It's always running. You start up a tenant, you build a dev tenant, your tenant without knowing it, it's running and classifying information based on the types of data that I declared. You can then build your own. Do I want to create my own custom information types? Do I want to build my own exact data match scenarios? Do I want to build my own document fingerprinting scenarios? Those, you stack that, you add that into the data classification service, and then Purview utilizes it. So like when I'm thinking about retention labels or sensitivity labels, you're going to have the data is going to drive the decisions, or can drive the decisions for that. And those decisions that you make around the data will help determine what your classification schema is. So when I'm building sensitivity and retention labels, you're going to have, again, the requirements for that are going to differ. Now, when I'm looking at the key differences in labels, right? So I've talked about sensitivity and retention. Sensitivity labels are built to protect emails, documents, sites, groups. It's our content. This is, I want to protect this information from something. After that, I can do something like encryption, conditional access control, doesn't matter, right? I'll show through the different protections you have. The big call out here is label persistence, right? So I talked about content lifecycle of your data. So if I label a file, I create a file, I put sensitive data in it, I automatically classify it, I then, let's say I email that file to Vlad because I want to share some sensitive information with him. When Vlad gets that file, it's going to still have that label with it. He could send it to Dahmer, to Bruno, he can keep sending it. That label is going to persist with it. And whatever controls I put in place at the front end will stay with it. And when I'm deploying that, I'm applying it to me. So I'm saying, I'm Drew, I'm going to get these labels. And then wherever I work, those labels are going to inherently come through. Retention labels, very different, right? The goal is now preservation and deletion, not protection. So retention labels are going to be deployed at the container, right? So I'm going to say I'm deploying these labels to these sites. These sites or these containers are going to have labels that when files are labeled there, they will retain or delete there. They'll be retained or delete in that action. And the persistence does not stay with it. So if I have a file on a site, let's say it's a board meeting minutes, I save that, the file's, the meeting's done, I mark a retention label on it, and I download that file and upload it somewhere else, that retention does not stay with it, right? That persistence does not stay with that file the same way as the sensitivity label did. It's retained in place at the point in time of label. So the way we're administering this, right? So those are two key label differences, right? I'm gonna start with the admin to come back to the end user side. So label administration's all in the the Purview Admin Center, or the Purview portal. So I want to show you that Purview portal a little bit here. So I'm going to take you into the Purview portal. So it is purview.microsoft.com. If you're familiar with the old compliance admin center, that's been replaced with the Purview portal. It did get a nice UX refresh in the last couple months here. In November, the old compliance portal is now deprecated. The biggest difference you're going to see here is that it has much better integration with the old Azure Purview, or the data governance stack. Now has a much bigger play here. So it's much easier to manage instead of having to go to Azure and to Purview. It was unified now into the Purview portal. The first thing I want to call out about the Purview portal is going to be that there are separate roles and scopes inside of Purview. So if I'm managing retention labels or sensitivity labels, there are going to be different administrative or privileged access that's required to get inside of here. So when I'm looking at this and I go into my Purview portal and I go into roles and scopes, and I go down here into role groups, what you're going to see is going to be an actual set of role groups that are specific to Purview. So these are not ones that are managed inside of Entra. These are ones that I'd actually manage, let's say, inside of Purview. So you're going to be, when you're managing Purview, you're going to be managing role groups inside of Purview, not just the role groups in Entra. So if I'm building someone that wants to manage sensitivity labels or information protection, we'll be building our own role groups or working within the role groups inside of Purview. Similar to if I'm working with, let's say, records management. Key scenario when you're looking at if you pull up the portal right now, when you're looking at it and saying, why don't I see it? Make sure when you're onboarding these solutions that you understand the roles and race you're responsible inside of the Purview portal. Now, if I go back home and I look at my solutions here, you're going to see the collection of solutions that we have inside of Purview. So very similar to the screenshot I had of all of the different apps that are available. These are the solutions that we have. And we're going to be focusing in on a few of these that support retention labels and sensitivity labels. But as you can see, there's a lot of other ones out here. And the only other one I wanted to call out is Compliance Manager. So if you're looking at getting started, you don't really know where to go or what to do for, let's say, regulatory compliance. Compliance Manager gives us our starting point to say, what are the types of controls that we should meet based on, let's say, the X type of assessment. So there is some pre-built assessments in here, or you can look in your industry and discover the ones that you want to try to match specifically. So there's the data protection baseline is the built-in one that you can work against. If not, I was like working with the NIST assessment if we're looking at basic data security, or HIPAA if you're looking at, let's say, specific healthcare scenarios. But these assessments will help understand the types of, or provide vision for you, the types of controls you need to put in place for those retention and sensitivity labels. So I want to talk about sensitivity labels first. So sensitivity labels are based on the Purview information protection stack. This does come from, sensitivity labels themselves come from the old, there was the Azure Information Protection world that's evolved a lot into the Purview Information Protection Suite. And the key scenarios for MPIP is going to be around discovering and classifying data at scale. And we can use automation and machine learning for that, right? So there's ways we can auto-classify this information. And information protection, these labels are built into our tools. So as I demo this, you'll see natively inside of my Office apps, inside of my browsers, inside of SharePoint, all of these labels are built into our tools. And if we need to, we can actually extend this into separate environments. So if I want to bring this into, you can now bring this into, let's say, Amazon S3 environments, or more structured data in Azure SQL, or it's now available in Power BI. It's actually available in Loop. You can build your own solutions using SDK into your own applications. You can really take this model, or if you have a third-party solution, that MPIP and these labels have extended into that. And when we're looking at labels, the things you can do with them, I would say, so to make sure I understand, I started this, you're going to have an information classification policy, because I'm sure we all do. If you don't, usually it's going to be, we have one, we haven't looked at it in 8 years. That will drive your label decision, right? I try not to make labels be based on simply the usage of it, right? Make them based on the types of data that are being controlled, like the actual information classification beyond just SharePoint. So if I have a physical file, a piece of paper, what is the classification we have for that? And then when I have, and Microsoft does have a pre-built set that I'll be showing that work well if you don't know where to go. And I will say most of the time we spend on label deployments is what labels are there and why. And that's not a technical decision, it's a information classification plan that we put together, and then the labels inherit that. So when we're deploying labels and we're working with them, we can deploy them by default, we can make them mandatory. So this is a scenario of, as I create files, what can I do with them? As I create an email, what should be labeled? Should I force labels for internal? Should I force labels for confidential? What am I going to force our users to do or allow them to maintain? I can use these to control things like privacy and sharing. And I can even empower these from at the SharePoint site and Microsoft Team level, which I'll show you. And one thing I've highlighted up on top as I go through this, I'm not going to go too deep into licensing. I'll put little bullet points up on the top of these to kind of show where licensing does affect it. My moral for this is, or my main point for this is, if you have automation, you're going to be living in an upgraded environment. If it's manual, the things I talk about will work. If you want to move to automatic, that's when the step up is required. So going a little bit further into sensitive labels, what's important that I like to call it here is that these labels, as I said, if I sent that file to Vlad, it inherited with it. These can also be read by other systems. Okay, so let's say I have a solution like Symantec or another, let's say CrowdStrike or Varonis. These solutions that you use for different scenarios can use sensitivity labels because these are actually metadata on the file. So it modifies the file enough that we can use this information for other stuff. And when we label it, we can label it at rest, we can label it in use, we can label it in transit. So there's different ways to apply the label. So I have a label deployed to me. I can do it when I'm creating a file. I can do it while the file's sitting in cold storage somewhere. I can have the file be labeled while it's actually in the transferring state, whether it's when I'm sharing it or sending it via email or downloading it or uploading it. You can do label manipulation at different points in time based on the policies that you build. Now, the key ones we're going to look through are going to be items. So we can put labels on items, and the items is going to be, I left it broader because we have files, emails. We can do Teams meetings. You can put them in Loop. You can put them in Power BI. These labels are all deployed via an item. And what we can do is main thing you can do is you can apply encryption. We can apply watermarks or visual markings. So let's say as I create an email and I put sensitive information in it, I can put visual markings that say, hey, this is confidential, FYI. So you need to know that. And then we even now have something called dynamic watermarks that that you'll see that's going to show even advanced scenarios of like my name being plastered in there based on a certain scenario. We can start to apply logic based on that, such as DLP, and we can report on it. So when you deploy labels, you don't have to deploy them with encryption or things like that. You can just do them as classification only and start to understand what data is in my organization. So we can do it at items. We can then do it at containers. So I can start to create containers such as teams, sites, and groups that have the same labels or different labels applied to them, sensitivity labels. Sensitivity labels on containers, I can manage things like privacy. I want to say privacy is your public or private. What I can do is say every Microsoft team that's called highly confidential, I want to ensure that it never moves to public. Or a public team is always going to be forcibly be public. I can manage that privacy to control risk. I can do things such as a conditional access based on label. So I could say I have a highly confidential site or highly confidential team that I want to enforce MFA or disallow access externally or require a corporate device. But the other sites, let's see where internet is, don't. So I can put logic based on conditional access to do that, and we can let our users decide this. So I can do it during new site creation, new team creation, team modification, or using different third-party tools that help manage your container lifecycle. And the last one we have in here is for sensitive labels for Copilot. So if you're deploying Copilot, working with Copilot, you'll read information protection is necessary, it benefits you. The actual integration for it is not like I can label the prompt or response or things like that. It's going to be, if I've added labels, sensitivity labels to my content, the Copilot prompts and responses will understand it. It will visualize them. So I can say if I search for a file or prompt for something and that response returns a file that's marked as highly confidential, it will show it in the response. And then if I create content using that file, it will inherit that. Okay? So there are ways that it does use it, but it doesn't protect the prompt itself. If you are using encryption, you do need to have the extract or view settings set for that. So if you wanted to use a label to not allow it to be searchable via Copilot, like never let it get indexed, you can have the extract and view encryption removed, and it would be available. It would not be available in Copilot. And what that looks like from perspective is that the stuff on the right, like where it says external files open in apps, like that's where the label stuff happens, right? Like it's using labels, it's applied to the files. Copilot then looks at the label and inherits that label, but the Copilot prompts and responses themselves again are not part of it. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to start with I'm going to start out with an Excel document. So if I open up an Office application, you're going to see the main, when you look at sensitivity labels, we have this default view of this dropdown that will be part of all of our Office applications. And as I go into this, what you're going to see is my collection of the information classification I've deployed to my organization. So you can see a public, general, internal, confidential, highly confidential, and then if I navigate into these, you'll start to see sub-labels applied. So I have a general anyone, I have an internal employees, I have a collection of confidential anyone, confidential custom, confidential employees. You see some of these have little locks. So some of these have encryption, some of them don't. Very similar to highly confidential. All of these are going to end up being encrypted, but you'll see I have different controls based on the different information classification priority. So I can take these files, you'll see my, I can also modify it now up in the, sorry, if I click on top navigation, you'll see I have a little green shield. That green shield is the label visualization. So you can see now I've not just in that view, I can have it in the Office view here, where I can come in and change the classification using that same drop down here to modify that file. So I could change that. Let's change this to confidential anyone. Change to confidential anyone. Call this Drew. And you'll see as I change that up in the top, you're going to have the different label be applied to that file. And then any control that would be added based on that is now included as part of that file. Very similar, so that happens in whether I'm in Excel, if I go up into PowerPoint, the same experience. If I go into open up an email, so I open up an email, I have the label experience right here. I also have the label experience over here. All of this is very similar. So throughout the applications, I have the same setting. Now, to give you an example, I have a file that I put a bunch of sensitive information into, an email, and I go out and I'm trying to email that file. You're going to see that my organization recommends that you change the sensitivity to confidential all employees because we have detected sensitive information. What this means is I can accept those recommendations. I can automatically apply those recommendations, but the point is that I'm based on rules or policies. So again, based on the data, what do I want to do with the data? In this example, I've said based on if I had more than 5 types of credit card numbers inside of a piece of content, I want to apply those recommendations. I want to let them know that there's sensitive data in this and you should change your label. You can do the same thing in Word, right? So if I put in social security numbers, you'll see Word gives us a nice little policy tip that says, hey, we recommend you change this. Right? We saw sensitive information. And again, if I put more or change it, I could even have this say, force the change of classification. If I start to look at this content, right? So if I go out and I look at some files out here. So I got into my Magneto Drew site, you're gonna see, actually, let's go to the site. If I go out into this external Drew site, you're gonna see I have files out here and the sensitivity value is visible inside of SharePoint, right? So even though the file is labeled with that sensitivity label, the SharePoint respects it. SharePoint understands it. SharePoint knows what it is. And you can see I have other little scenarios in here, which is around more DLP specific, but the point is that they're connected. So I'm thinking about protecting my data. I'm using a combination of things like DLP, which can say like, if I find sensitive data, I can't always force them to change the label. Like I can make one public, but I can stop them from sharing it. But I have these multi-layer levels of control that tell us what that content is and what we want to do with it. Now, let's say I'm in this site called External Drew. You're also going to see something up here that says private group, general, external. So I have a scenario where I obviously need to share content externally. I want to protect that content externally. You'll see I have labels that go there externally. Now, I also have the ability then to share this content. So I'll go to the site. Let's say I want to share it with people. Let's do this. So I want to share this with, I'll just say, this example, vlad@vlad.com. I know it's not a real address, but you'll see it's not going to stop me, right? I'm going to come in there and I'll be able to share this file, even though it's marked as confidential. If Vlad got this, since it's confidential to anyone, he'd actually be able to open it. But on this site, right? So on the site called External Drew, I can share externally. If I go to my Magneto group site, you're gonna see something a little different. It's private group, internal up on top. Now, if I go try to share a file in here, and I do the same thing, let's go to people I choose, and I do vlad@vlad.com. You're gonna see on this site, I can only share with people inside my organization. Those settings are dictated based on the action by applying the sensitivity to the site or to the group or to the container. So right, I have files, these files have labels. I now have sites, these containers have labels. Together, I can start to put this picture together to say, what data do I have inside of M365 that's risky, that we want to control, right? Let's say, do I have files that are on a public site that are highly confidential? Right? So I get this mismatch. Do I have stuff that's on an internal site that, on a highly confidential site that's marked as public? How can you can start to now see discrepancies between that. And I can, depending on the sensitivity of the container, I can actually put controls then, like sharing, available out here. I can even do things like more advanced, like take a highly confidential team. So I have a site called Highly Confidential Drew. So if I even go to one called, here, let's do this, let's go live. So I just went to timely365.com/highly confidential Drew. You're going to see I can even put in controls in place that say I need to have specific devices that can only meet specific SharePoint sites. So I can put this an example of conditional access based on a label of a site. So I can't actually get to that site unless I'm on a device that actually meets my device compliance. And that's all based on the label. So if I took my site, and technically I'm not going to do it live, but if I took my site and I moved it to highly confidential, not external, right, just highly confidential, since I'm on this, my personal device, not my Timely device, I actually would lose access to that site based on the label, because this has a lockdown control that I've instantiated. And the same if I go inside of Teams. So if I open up Teams, and let's say I want to create a new team. So I'll pull up Teams here. Let's actually do, since that's gonna do in SharePoint, then I could say create site. When I pick a site, pick a standard team, Drew, click next. You're gonna see I'm also forcing these containers. So if I go into create a new team, it would say the same thing, that it's mandatory to select a label. Right? So when I create a new Word document or new Excel file, you saw it defaulted to general. I can change, I can manipulate it. If I create a new container, it's going to force me to apply the sensitivity label. So I'm now building this process of trust as these things are moving forward and understanding of what these can and can't do. So coming back into the other labeling side of it, we have retention labels. Right? So sensitivity, we protected information. We now have to worry about retention. So what you have to worry about is data hoarding. Right? So retention, let's say even if we've done all of our great protection, data hoarding is the risk that we have. And keeping our data longer than needed is a bad thing, and removing data sooner than we should is also a bad thing. In a true example, this is from Microsoft, that if you leave a company and if you want to have that information removed and you don't remove that information, you can actually have fines against you because you have not removed that data after whether it's been a breach or the personnel asking to have that go away. That expected that it would be gone. So the challenge is, and now with Copilot, keeping too much data also adds risk from an AI perspective. So we have these challenges of keeping too much, getting rid of it at the wrong time, people mainly keeping stuff for too long. What can we do? So in Purview, we have two scenarios, right? Or two solutions. We have DLM, so data lifecycle management, and RM, which is records management. One is your starting point. If I want to work with something, I want to start with basic retention, and then the step up is into records management, which is much more of your records managers, and I'll go through the different solutions that RMs have. So the way to understand how DLM and RM works is that they are connected. So I'm going to click through this. You see how all of these work together. So we have Syntex, which is part of Premium. We have our M365 suite. Inside of DLM, we have our classification engine, right? The same thing that we talked about for sensitivity labels can work with RM and DLM. Now, the difference we have in here is that depending on DLM and RM, we also can bring in other data connectors, other solutions into Purview. If we want to bring in things like Slack and Bloomberg, we can actually bring that into M365 and use the DLM and RM solutions for this. But the point is, the data is still based on your data. So it doesn't matter how the data gets in there, the bottom right here is going to be, we're going to manage it with RM and DLM. So if I keep going, with the different types of things we have, the two main scenarios in retention we have are going to be policies and labels. Okay, so I'm focusing on labels, but you need to understand how retention policies come into play when you're dealing with your retention schedule. So retention labels are something we apply and are specific to a file. This file is going to have a label based on contractual role A. This is a contract. Retention policies are not labels. Retention policies are broad strokes to say, I want to keep every piece of OneDrive for the next 5 years. I want to keep all data in, I want to delete all data in these SharePoint sites after 5 years. So policies are broad. They're not based on labels. Labels are what we're focused on, which will be manually applied to content, which can do the same thing. I want to keep this content. I want to keep and delete this content, or I want to delete this content. Those are the three main things you'll be thinking about based on the label or the policy together. Now, understanding retention is important to know if we have lots of different retention scenarios. The big thing is retention always wins. So if I have a deletion policy and I have a retention policy, if the retention policy is longer, it's going to win. Nothing will ever get deleted. Okay. So if I have, let's say, legal holds, those are types of retention. If I have let's say I have a single file on hold or that has a retention label on a site and I delete the site, that file is not going to be deleted. Okay. Retention will always win over deletion. And if you have a shorter deletion period, so if I have delete after 1 year, delete after 2 years, delete after 1 year will win because that's the principle of this. So labels are best for targeted scenarios. I want to have a label here for this file that I can automatically apply. I could say these files in this library, these files with this type of data are all going to be automatically applied with this retention. And then you have more choices. So I can say after the file's been labeled, after the file's been modified, after X date, you could have more details around the label versus just a broad stroke for a policy. And we can start to do things like more advanced things like disposition reviews or metadata enhancements, or even trigger Power Automate's flows based on the label job. So we have three main label types. We have a regular label, a record label, and a regulatory record label. So when I create a label, it's important to know that when I pick it, it can only be modified when I create it, and I can't change it. I'm primarily going to be living with the regular labels, which is going to be, I have a label, it's going to be able to retain things and delete things. A record label is more advanced label that allows us to have point-in-time control of it, or more advanced controls after the record has hit that disposition. And the last one is a regulatory record, which is incredibly powerful and only should be used in very specific regulatory control scenarios, such as, and even more recently, we've been able to get by this with like the SE17-A control, which is more of your worm storage control, The point is these will never be changed. You can't modify these ever. It's even on the back end from the M365 admin side. These are your very specific requirements. Well, you'll start with regular, use record when you need to, and regulatory would be only in a potentially break class scenario. When labels are being applied, there's a couple different ways to do it. So we have manual, we have default labeling, and we have automatic labeling. So automatic labeling, similar to what we talked about with classification, it's going to be what is that data? Can we do it based on metadata? Can we do it based on the type of sensitive data? The difference with retention is you have a little more flexibility with like location based. So I could say files in this site with this metadata has it. Right? I can actually use KQL queries for it beyond just the out of the box data classification. And then I can use different things like SharePoint Premium or PowerShell to even to go more advancedly to apply these labels. I can manually apply them or I can apply them by default. So different ways to apply retention, different than sensitivity, because sensitivity again flows between all of your apps, while retention is very specific on like this SharePoint site. This SharePoint site, when I put a file here, can do something. We'll apply this retention label. When I'm looking at DLM versus RM, so data lifecycle versus records, records management is your step up. That's your E5 advanced capabilities. DLM lets us manually deploy content with a regular retention label, not a record label. And we can publish these retention policies at a container for SharePoint, for OneDrive, for groups, for Engage, for Teams, and we can use static scope. So I can say I want to deploy these labels to these sites, right? Very specific. And then when I go to that site, I can apply that label. RM is the big brother, which if you are dealing with specific compliance controls, you are going to have records management. That's kind of mandatory in my world. So I can start to apply files and make them a record. I can use a file plan to determine different classifications based on that record. What does that record mean? Why do I have it? I can do event-based retention. So after X event, after contract close, go get all the contracts, or a client leaves, trigger events that goes and triggers data. That's one of the main scenarios you have to use in large organizations is events and disposition. So after 3 years, someone needs to go review this, or we need to change it. All can happen with disposition. And then you have more advanced scenarios, again with RM, but the last one would be that I want to talk about would be adaptive scope. So I could say, I want to have in these users' mailboxes, everyone that's in the EU have separate retention controls than someone that's in the US. Retention labels. I can do that automatically by adapting that scope based on user information or site information. So instead of static, it can adapt. I don't have to maintain a list of sites that have these different labels. Last thing to touch on retention before I show you is going to be the different, I want to highlight the record label locked and unlocked. So with record labels, you have the ability to lock them and to unlock them. Okay? So I can say, I have a file, I have this board meeting minutes, I have it locked, I can't delete it, right? Regular labels, I can actually delete the content. Record labels allow us to lock that deletion and the modification of that content. That's going to be one of your key requirements, deciding if we need to use a record label versus a regular label. Okay. So I'm going to show you before I close up. So retention labels are going to look like this. Not a much different demo compared to sensitivity, because when I look at retention labels, they're really only going to be in, you only can view them inside of SharePoint, okay? So if I'm looking at, let's say, this test document, you still have the retention label visibility inside of SharePoint, and this doesn't follow with the document. So if I pull this up, the way you modify manually the retention labels is going to be through the right panel inside of SharePoint, getting you access in Teams, OneDrive, but the document library view. When I do that, I can click apply label, and then I'll have my collection of retention labels that are there. Okay? So this is the visualization that I have. If I apply it manually, if I apply them automatically, it doesn't matter. This is how I would actually be applying them. So I can take this file, say this is an invoice. If I pick invoice, whatever retention rule I have for that, I pick it. Let's say timely invoice. This now is going to have a retention date. It's going to say who applied it. And it's going to say this file has a retention label of timely invoice. And for this one, as you saw, it was only a 1-day retention. I will say demoing retention it's never easy to demo like a 7-year retention. So after 1 day, this file will actually be queued up for deletion. Based on this record, based on this rule that I have, I can do things like retain forever. But again, you pick the dates and times that you want to review these. But from an application standpoint, it doesn't matter if I'm in Teams, OneDrive, whatever, I will be applying these retention labels right here. And very similarly, I can also apply sensitivity labels through the GUI. So the labeling solution we're looking at, very different teams, all applied inside of SharePoint and OneDrive to either retain that content or protect that content. Okay, so that's a lot. That's a lot in 50 minutes here. How do we do this? What can I do? How do I even get started with this stuff? And I don't ever try to combine these, okay? So I will say, me, myself, other folks in the community that work with other companies I've worked with, the crawl, walk, run methodology works really well for labeling, because especially if you're in retention, you can have a long time for retention projects. Some of these can take months, if not years, to get these deployed, to understand and manage and test these. I'm in the middle of one where we're deploying a couple hundred labels for an organization. It's going to take us probably a full 12 months to deploy it out to 30,000 sites out there and do a lot of education and training. Sensitivity, again, crawl, walk, run. We spend a lot of time figuring out what are the right classifications. How are we going to pilot this? What are the rules for the sensitivity labels? You spend a lot of time on mandatory or default. What should be mandatory? What should be default? And I've never gone through a sensitivity label project and not had it be slow. Again, you could deploy a label in 5 minutes. That doesn't make it right. Same with both of these. And you don't want to go backwards. That's probably another point is going backwards from encryption or going backwards from retention is really hard. So spend more time up front figuring out what these need to be for either label solution, and don't just use IT. Right? So I've stepped into places that'll say, why don't we just do a 7-year retention label? Why don't we just do why don't we just have the labels be called like internal, external, internal site, external site? It's like, well, those are usage, not actual classification. Right? So you don't always want to have usage and classification be together. Branch out to figure out from a legal department, from an information data governance group, what is important in my work. If I'm looking at classification, for these, use the power of the cloud. So a common question would be, should I classify before I migrate, or should I figure out what I can't migrate because I don't have retention on-prem? Well, how about we migrate it and use the power of the cloud to do that identification? Let that data classification service run and figure this stuff out. In both of these, you need to concentrate on the end user experience. Half the time I just say like, all right, we're gonna deploy labels, and they're like, what? You have to think, what's into the user? Why should I label? What's the downside if I don't label? You need executive trainings on these. You need executive leadership on this. This is a organizational change that you have to inform different people to say why. And then they'll be like, I don't get it. What does confidential mean? And you better be ready to say, what does confidential mean? Like, so we've moved to making sure you have like yearly reviews of your information classification policy, so people know what type of data is confidential or know what type of data needs to be retained for 7 years. Okay? Like that is a big part of this. And don't get stuck with nothing. Okay, so I would rather have some label, a label on one site, a label on for 5 people than nothing. Right? Don't get stuck on paralysis by analysis and labeling. Get started with something and go from there. You don't need to have labeled the entire plan for label deployment for all, let's say 20 business units in 20 countries across the globe, all in one sitting. Chunk it up, make it attainable, and start with something, because the longer you wait, the worse you are for rot, for risk, and the scenarios I talked about up front. So with that, that's what I have. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me at any time. My email, my Twitter account's here. You can always go through Syskit. They know how to find me as well for this kind of stuff. And I'll stick around for a little bit for some Q&A around anything labeling perspective, but I can pass it over to you, Bruno, to talk a little bit about Syskit.
Thank you, Drew, for the awesome presentation. And you do have some really interesting questions in the chat. We have some really good ones for you, but we'll give you a few seconds to drink some water, breathe a bit while everybody puts their question in. And meanwhile, Bruno will show you how SysKit can help you ensure that sensitive data is protected. Bruno, are you ready?
Yeah, should be. You can see my screen. I should be ready to go.
Can.
Perfect. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Vlad, for the intro. And as you already did a comprehensive intro for SysKit endpoint, I'm going to skip that part and I'm just going to dive straight into the demo. So within the demo, we'll show you how SysKit can help you leverage sensitivity labels both on the container and the file level. So first off, let's start off with some simple visibility and filtering option that we can use sensitivity labels for. So let's say I have all of my sites here, but I need to focus on more sensitive sites. So in this overview screen, I can just simply enable sensitivity labels column and then more easily filter only those sites or workloads that are sensitive. Now, if you want to go one step further, when we go inside the QA team and run a permission matrix report, that will get us all of the permissions on the files down to the file level, we can see that we'll have usually a lot of content here that's, simply speaking, unmanageable. Now, again, I want to focus just on the sensitive files. So let's enable sensitivity labels on the file level here, and let's just choose financial and HR, for example. Now I get a much more cleaner list, and I can focus on just what I'm interested in. So as with almost all reports in SysKit, it's not just reporting, but if you see something that you don't like, something that makes you go, oh, no, this is not right, like this anyone link on the sensitive file, you can simply go ahead and remove it. Let's say we'll say Alex is cool, but for Frane and Victoria as their external users, we might want to restrict permissions to read only instead of edit. Now you'll have these notifications and you can spot sensitive labels all across, like in this Copilot readiness style, you'll notice that we're checking for sharing links, but then specifically checking for sharing links, anonymous or company-wide, that are set on sensitive files. Again, with a click of a button, I can go in here, I can see who exactly got the sensitive link, and if needed, I can remove it. However, one of the challenges that we saw is that adoption for sensitivity label is rather poor amongst companies. So what we've done, we'll now take a look at the other way scenario. So let's filter all the sites that don't really have sensitivity labels, right? Here, our admins can simply bulk select them and then manage sensitivity either on their own, which is maybe not the best choice, but better way to do it is to actually ask the owners of the workspaces to assign sensitivity labels to the site and thus provide some just basic protections over the content. Now, what you can also do is you can ask them to apply metadata tags to the sites as well. While those don't have an inherent security perspective, they can be used to target workloads in combination with sensitivity labels with the governance policies. So let's quickly show you how you can do just that. And for this, we'll utilize our rules engine, where we can set up different rules, like I'll just edit this one, and we can set this, I want to target workspaces that have the confidential label on them. But let's say I want to be more specific, and then I'll use the custom metadata tag for, let's say, I'll just target confidential sites that belong to the finance department. Then when I go next, I already have my access review here, meaning that owners will get to periodically check for all the permissions and the users on their content, but I can apply additional governance policies easy as well. So we'll do a minimum number of owners to make sure that there's enough people taking care of the site. We'll apply a version limit to make sure that it doesn't grow too large, but it also keeps in check with the financial records retention needs. So we can do things like that. We can also check for shadow users to make sure that the files aren't directly shared to people underneath, not on the top level members and owner structure. So we get notifications on that. And with the combination of sensitivity labels and metadata tags, I can really pinpoint and apply appropriate governance policies to the workspaces that I want. Okay, so this is just a brief overview of what you can actually do and how you can tackle retention label and increase adoption, as well as apply more governance policies that will take care of your workspaces throughout their life cycle. With that, with this short grid demo, I'm going to be done. But if anything interests you, you can always come to our website and sign up for a free demo to click around your own environment at your own pace. Vlad, let's take it back to you for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Bruno, for the excellent presentation. I see Drew is back as well, and we have some very good questions that popped up in the chat. First of all, let me zoom in here a bit. It ran away. Let me start with an easy one for you, Drew. Is it possible to use auto labeling based on SharePoint metadata, so managed properties?
So we can use auto labeling using SharePoint metadata for retention labels, but not for sensitivity labels. Retention labels will allow us to use a KQL query to say property value, let's say dot category 1 has a we want to apply a retention label to that. So I can use KQL. Sensitivity labels we can't. We'd have to. The only way to get that would be actually just not worth it to try it without using anything native.
Awesome. Then another question here. I have used sensitivity labels from out of the box, and then could see most of them were false positives with the content. Is there a way I can validate automatically as currently I'm doing it manually?
I'm laughing because of the false positive route. So I started with that presentation, like, we understand your data, you need to know your data. The out of the box SITs, if you're using, especially like the PII ones, PHI ones for like names, you're gonna get a mountain of false positives. So what we do is it's not wrong. The way to think about it is the starting point. Okay, so the best way to take that would be, you're gonna get false positives, the default SIT, take batches of those, look at where the false positives are, and create your own SIT. That's going to be the best route. I almost always create my own SIT, sensitive information type, based on that, right? So if I'm going to have a PII one, you can replicate the PII one and refine it down, and then that would be the one that you use, right? So if it's going to, some of those are very, very broad. For auto labeling, creating your own SIT is almost mandatory for some. Especially if you get into like confidential, highly confidential. When you get into the step up, creating your own is going to be the only way to get rid of those false positives, because there's not a way I can change it, right? You can only move it up by quantity. I can't move it up. I definitely recommend maxing out the confidence, like high confidence only, higher count. Focus on those. Anything low or medium, you're going to have a mountain of false positives. So high, move to high, and create your own SITs are the ways to move away from false positives.
Awesome. A question for you, Bruno, now. Are there advisory components of Siskitpoint that will help us do planning for DRM and sensitivity labels?
So currently, I would say that you can use only the existing, let's say, potential policy violations, such as private workspaces shared with anyone, reviews of the links, or workspaces that are shared with a large group of people to potentially discover oversharing and stuff that needs to be labeled more appropriately. But I do believe we're in the early stages of research and development for, let's say, more smart suggestions of potentially, informing you which sensitivity label to use for the content. But that's, for now, still in the future.
Awesome. Drew, now back to you. What is the difference between role-based access control and the labels?
So RBAC, the role-based access control, it's a broad statement there. The RBAC can be thought of it's interesting. So I don't compare the two. I try not, so because RBAC, I could be said is role-based access control can be done like in the Purview portal of like who can do what. RBAC, there's no RBAC set up for retention labels. Role-based access control at the file level, if I use sensitivity labels, can only be done through encryption. Okay? So it uses Azure RMS, but I can stay based on, so the way sensitivity labels work with encryption is that it requires authentication. So I could say highly confidential files, or based on the label, these groups or these domains are the people that have access to it, right? So if I want an internal label, I can say, you have to be part of, let's say, the syskit domain to be able to have access to it. So I put RBAC on the label itself, and I can also have RBAC from the governance side, the governance side of who can manage the applications and what, and the labels themselves. So the only RBAC controls are at the file level with sensitivity labels via encryption. Same with email, right? I could say do not forward. Do not forward is a type of encryption. So RBAC can be as granular as you want. I could create a label and call it Vlad's label and just put Vlad's name on it. And technically, I could like lock myself out of it because I could say it's literally only Vlad's label. So the RBAC can be as granular as single account all the way up at the per label, all the way up to groups or domains or tenants as large as you would want, as long as there's some boundary in it by label.
Awesome. Now we have 4 questions into one, so let me read them one by one. Does this work with GCC High, Drew?
Yes, there are differences. So retention labels and sensitive labels definitely work in GCC High. It's funny you mentioned that CMMC stuff. I've done 3 GCC High deployments in the last year and a half-ish with all the CMMC stuff going on. So there are nuances when you get into like the portal itself. Like I don't have a GCC High portal I could demo, obviously, but the labeling, the ability to label both is 100% there. The nuance is in the heavy details of like auto classification and the usage of the labels themselves, like opening them in a specific app. But labeling 101, label 201, all the way to like 400, it's all there.
I get you, Drew. I'm Canadian, so I'm even further away from having a GCC High account. So
I actually had access to, I almost had access to one to like demo and work with. It's been hard because you actually have to be a federal contractor.
Yeah.
But
okay, now a question that I hope you'll understand because it uses a lot of acronyms. Is this the solution recommended for controlling CUI in accordance with CMMC, so NIST 800-171?
yeah,
So maybe you can also explain the acronyms while you're at it for me and everybody else.
Sure. So CUI is controlled unclassified information. It's CUI. CMMC is going to be your control requirements to any time you're working with. This follows in the GCC world. So let's say if I'm working with weapon systems, or one I did was a company that was a subcontractor where they worked on parts for a helicopter, and those specific parts have control requirements that would have things like CUI or controlled unclassified information. And those have to be held in GCC High or GCC environments or DoD, depending on where you're at. And then you as an organization have to go through a CMMC compliance check that is done through the feds, and you would get a score, and you have to be approved for that to be able to be a contractor and work with that type of data. So in the M365 world, it can be as basic as I have a blueprint of a helicopter part that is sent via email, right, in my email, in my mailbox. Sensitivity labels 100% are the tool used to classify that inside of M365 for CUI, non-CUI, depending on the classification you have, like secret, top secret. And then retention also gives us the ability to make sure we remove it. So when I'm going through a CMMC compliance check, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, the requirements, you could actually go into Compliance Manager, run a CMMC report, and see that there are requirements for classification to meet that. There's a lot more around CMMC. We actually have, we're doing a lot of CMMC compliance work for companies. But yeah, the answer is labeling is the part that meets CUI for controlled unclassified information, because you're able to classify it then and control it.
Awesome. Now, where was I here? Okay. Can we see the labels in a column in a document library in SharePoint? And can we automate stuff in Power Automate depending on that label? So is it something that will be shown in Power Automate?
Yeah, so as I showed, both labels definitely show up in, are visible by SharePoint now. So they are properties available in SharePoint, especially retention. You can do stuff with, so SharePoint Premium, like document processing, let's say, you could have a file that gets identified and added as automatically add a retention label. And then let's say if it has X retention label applied, connect to that via Power Automate and move stuff around. That's actually been an incredibly common practice for us, or not super common, but possible, and we've done it. Because especially with retention, you probably have to move stuff around. And you can actually you can actually label stuff via Power Automate as well. So Power Automate can connect back to that. Its API is metadata. So yes, it's 100% visible in SharePoint. You 100% can work stuff in Power Automate. 98% of the time, I do it with retention. Sensitivity, a little less. I can only think of one scenario where I've wanted to check it, but it is metadata, and you can search it, and you can filter it, and similar to Syskit, that's how we're able to find and report on that information for those, because it's in SharePoint, not per file.
Awesome. And last question for you, Drew. How can I get granular with the labels, in a sense that if a user has access to a label for one project, but I don't want them to see documents with the same label in another project? In this case, a different document library could have a different project.
Yeah, so there's no way to change RBAC within the same label. The only way to do that is going to be to move off of your what would be considered a standard label, and then the other option you have for encryption is a UDP label, or user-defined permission. Okay, so you have I can have a project. Let's say I call it Project Drew, and we have Project Vlad. Right? We're two different projects, but we have both files are confidential. We're building something really cool, and we're going to mark it as highly confidential. But I don't want Vlad in my project, and Vlad doesn't want me in his project, right? The highly confidential label itself would not have that granularity. If I wanted to have that granularity, what you would do is you would create a highly confidential custom, or what I have is a highly confidential, like in my demo, is highly confidential. I think I call it defined, and you can then define it within that project itself. I could say, and the newest version or the latest update is I can actually follow SharePoint perms. So like I could apply the highly confidential custom label to that library where the Project Drew is, and then only the people who have access to Project Drew, even if I download that file, would not have access, like Vlad wouldn't have access to it. So the only way to get more granular is to go away from default encryption to user-defined, and then user-defined is going to be either predetermined by myself putting it on there, or SharePoint defining that label, defining the perms on that label.
Awesome. Well, this is it for the questions. And once again, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. As mentioned, everyone who registered for the event will receive a recording of the webinar. So if you loved it, you want to send it to your colleagues so they can also learn more, feel free to do so. Drew, thank you so much again for today's presentation. Amazing as always. Anything else you'd like to say before we wrap things up?
No, so last thing I'll say is to emphasize that labeling is complicated. This is lots to take in 50 minutes. Again, don't try to boil the ocean with this stuff. It takes time, and it's okay for it to take time. Understanding what it can and can't do, and those questions are really good, because the devil is in the details with when you deploy this stuff. Getting a tool like Syskit definitely helps understand where and how you can deploy these.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for everyone, if you have any further question regarding Syskit Point or any of our products, please reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. Bruno will be the one personally answering all of them. So it was a pleasure having you all here, and see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.